then elects a
We'll leave the ceremony at this point. President Trump heading back to Washington, later to Camp David. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council meeting on North Korea's missile program. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson moments ago criticizing China for supplying oil to North Korea and Russia for using North Korean laborers. Here's what he had to say.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. On behalf of the United States, I thank Japan and Foreign Minister Kono for convening this ministerial session on the growing threat from North Korea. Upon taking office, President Trump identified North Korea as the United States' greatest national security threat. That judgment remains the same today. After its ICBM launch on November the 29th, the North Korean government claimed that it now possessed the capability to strike any location in the continental United States. North Korea's growing capabilities reflect a direct threat to our security and the security of the entire world. We do not regard this claim as an empty threat. North Korean regime's continuing unlawful missile launches and testing activities signal its contempt for the United States, its neighbors in Asia, and all members of the United Nations. In face of such a threat, inaction is unacceptable for any nation. Through a series of robust Security Council resolutions, this body has taken a leading role in condemning North Korea's unlawful nuclear and missile programs and imposing consequences. The international community remains firm in our determination that we will not accept a nuclear North Korea. Each UN member state must fully implement all existing UN Security Council resolutions. For those nations who have not done so or who have been slow to enforce Security Council resolutions, your hesitation calls into questions whether your vote is a commitment to words only, but not actions. For countries who have not taken action, I urge you to consider your interest, your allegiances, and your values in the face of this grave and global threat. We believe that more can and must be done beyond enforcing the minimum requirements of the Security Council resolutions directed at the DPRK. Last spring, the United States initiated a peaceful pressure campaign of economic and diplomatic sanctions against North Korea with the intent of setting conditions for North Korea to engage in serious negotiations toward the complete, verifiable, and irreversible abandonment of its nuclear weapons programs. Our resolve to continue this campaign is even greater today. Over the past year, many allies and partners of the United States have joined our campaign, going beyond mere compliance with the Security Council resolutions. We ask these nations to continue to increase pressure through unilateral action. Doing so will further isolate North Korea politically and economically, cutting off support and funds for its unlawful nuclear and missile programs. We particularly call on Russia and China to increase pressure, including going beyond full implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Continuing to allow North Korean laborers to toil in slave-like conditions inside Russia in exchange for wages used to fund nuclear weapons programs calls into question Russia's dedication as a partner for peace. Similarly, as Chinese crude oil flows to North Korean refineries, the United States questions China's commitment to solving an issue that has serious implications for the security of its own citizens. Recently, the North Korean regime has sought to portray UN sanctions as harmful to women and children. But this is a regime that hypocritically spends billions on nuclear and ballistic missile programs while its own people suffer great poverty. The regime could feed and care for women, children, and ordinary people of North Korea if it chose the welfare of its people over weapons development. The DPRK has a choice. It can reverse course, give up its unlawful nuclear weapons program, and join the community of nations, or it can continue to condemn its people to poverty and isolation. The regime in Pyongyang bears the ultimate responsibility for the well-being of its people. North Korea claims to undertake its nuclear weapons program as an essential step for the survival of its regime. In making this choice, North Korea has made itself less secure and its economy has become further isolated and disconnected from the global economy. We have been clear that all options remain on the table in the defense of our nation. But we do not seek, nor do we want, war with North Korea. The United States will use all necessary measures to defend itself against North Korean aggression, but our hope remains that diplomacy will produce a resolution. As I said earlier this week, a sustained cessation of North Korea's threatening behavior must occur before talks can begin. North Korea must earn its way back to the table. The pressure campaign must and will continue until denuclearization is achieved. We will, in the meantime, keep our channels of communication open. Our message today is one that this body has heard before and one that we will continue to repeat. The United States will not allow the regime in Pyongyang to hold the world hostage. We will continue to hold North Korea accountable for its reckless and threatening behavior today and in the future. We ask every nation here to join us in exerting sovereignty to protect all of our people. We also ask all to join a unified effort to achieve a complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Secretary of State Tillerson from Within the Hour at the UN. They're talking about the North Korean missile program. Live now with the representative from the United Kingdom, Mark Field, speaking.
They didn't consider themselves to be racially pure. They heard multiple examples of violations of foreign citizens' rights, including, of course, Mr. President, of those of your own country, Japan. Today, we meet yet again to condemn North Korea's illegal and dangerous nuclear weapons program. Kim Jong-un claims that he wants to be a responsible actor and that he wishes to bring security and prosperity to his people. The regime's actions, exemplified by their systematic violation of human rights and their nuclear weapons program, demonstrate precisely the opposite intent. North Korea's pursuit of an intercontinental nuclear weapon is increasingly destabilizing for us all. North Korea has fired some 20 ballistic missiles this year. We've seen 3 intercontinental ballistic missile launches and 2 missiles launched across and over the territory of northern Japan. Now, in response to these actions, the Council has unanimously and appropriately decided to impose the strictest sanctions in a generation upon North Korea. Our community of nations has shown its deep condemnation of the regime by taking these sanctions seriously. This has, of course, started to have an impact. We all have the responsibility of ensuring that these sanctions are fully and properly implemented so that they have the desired effect. Now that North Korea's arms dealers are discovering that their usual routes to clients are closed, so their diplomats are struggling to process bank transactions for contraband goods, their exporters of manual labor are finding their contracts are not being renewed. So we must not just keep this pressure up, but we must increase it. We must share information and expertise to prevent North Korea from using front companies or illicit channels to evade sanctions. We must all cooperate fully with the UN's highly competent and professional panel of experts on North Korea's sanctions, and we strongly commend their work and will continue actively to support them. But we should be clear that the reason we enforce sanctions is to force Kim Jong-un to see that he has a choice of 2 paths. His current path will lead his country to greater poverty and isolation and threatens not just North Korea's, but the global security. He must choose to change course. He can choose to comply with the UN Security Council resolutions and to join the community of law-abiding nations. He can choose to let his people express themselves through debate and commerce. This is the real path to security and prosperity for the North Korean people. Only Kim can now make this choice, and we must all work together here to persuade him to make the right choice. So our message to Kim Jong-un and his regime must be clear and united. For the well-being of your countrymen and the safety of your neighbors in the wider world, you must change course. And I hope that the North Korean representative here today conveys these strong messages back to Pyongyang. Mr. President, we must all work together and use all the diplomatic and economic tools at our disposal to deliver this uncompromising message. Let us stand firm. Let us stand fast to our values. The world looks to all of us here to defend our system of international security. For the sake of future generations of humankind, we must now rise to this challenge.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Field for his statement. And now give floor to the representative of Egypt.
السيد الرئيس، تستمر مصر في تأكيد إدانتها
its strong condemnation of the DPRK's activities of nuclear armament, development and launching of ballistic missiles in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions, in a manner that threatens international and regional peace and security. This is based on Egypt's constant commitment to the need to preserve the credibility of the NPT regime and the credibility of the Security Council. Egypt also reiterates the need for all UN organs, international organizations, and the international community to decisively address any threat to the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime without discrimination or double standards. It is a given that Egypt accords importance to the need for all parties to respect binding international consensus, given that the NPT is one of the most important pillars of the existing security regime. There is also a need for the Security Council to deal with any threat to this regime and with any measures that stand in the way of its universalization in a consistent and non-discriminatory manner. Egypt is also cognizant that the repeated violations of the DPRK by the DPRK of the Security Council resolutions, they constitute a threat to peace and security and the stability of Northeast Asia and the national security of friendly countries, namely Japan and the Republic of Korea. Therefore, Egypt continues to call on the DPRK to immediately cease any violations and measures that contravene Security Council resolutions. And we call on the DPRK to abstain from any escalation that would lead to further tension and instability in a manner that threatens international and regional peace and security. We call on the DPRK to go back to acceding to the NPT as a non-nuclear state and to implement the IAEA safeguards regime without delay. Mr. President, Egypt reiterates the need for the Security Council and all UN organs to bear their responsibilities in this respect through finding a sustainable, peaceful settlement of the troubling situation in the Korean Peninsula. This settlement should provide for total elimination of nuclear weapons and reaching sustainable peace between the two Koreas in accordance with the provisions of the Security Council resolutions. This includes endeavors to revive negotiations and providing a favorable environment to this end, so that we can exit this vicious circle of continued violations by the DPRK of the Security Council resolutions. At a time, the Security Council only imposes additional sanctions without a clear political prospect for the solution of the crisis. This only leads to more deterioration that would lead to a real international catastrophe. In this respect, Egypt has followed with interest the visit recently paid by Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, to Pyongyang this month. This is the first of its kind by a high-level UN official since 2010. We consider that continuing engagement and dialogue with the DPRK is an imperative to maintain chances for reviving negotiations and dialogue as a way to reach a peaceful solution to this serious crisis that has a bearing on our security at large. In this respect, I would like to thank Mr. Feltman for his briefing on the 12th of December on the outcome of his visit. We underscore the need for continuing engagement and dialogue and not to lose hope in the ability of the international community to reach a peaceful settlement that meets the agreed-upon provisions in the Security Council resolutions with regard to nuclear disarmament and bringing sustainable peace in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt for his statement. I now give floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, China would like to thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. China firmly opposes the development by the DPRK of its nuclear and missile programs in violation of the Security Council resolutions and urges the DPRK to abide by the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Since the beginning of this year, the situation on the Korean Peninsula has been one of constant tension, while the DPRK continued to conduct nuclear tests and missile launching in defiance of the universal opposition by the international community. The parties concerned kept expanding military exercises and scaling up show-off force. Escalation of tension on the Korean Peninsula to the point of risking spiraling out of control is not in any party's interest. Mr. President, the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula has lasted for over 2 decades with deep historical causes and grave and complex current context. Reviewing the evolution of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula, we can see that when the parties concerned moved towards each other and respected each other's concerns, it was possible to achieve results, whereas when the parties took tough stances and disregarded the security of the other side, it would lead to the deterioration of the situation. The current situation on the Korean Peninsula is mired in the vicious circle of tough posturing and confrontation, which hardly makes one optimistic about its future. However, the hope for peace is not totally obliterated. There is still a possibility for negotiation, and the option of use of force is unacceptable. China believes that all parties concerned should keep in mind the big picture of maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, judge the situation calmly, make wise choices, and take practical actions. First, it is necessary to put an immediate end to rhetoric and actions that are unfavorable to denuclearization as well as peace and security of the Korean Peninsula and ease the situation as soon as possible. The tough positions taken by the parties concerned can only escalate tension, deepen division, and increase mutual trust, and therefore are not helpful to the security of all parties. The parties concerned should keep calm and exercise restraint to prevent the situation on the Korean Peninsula from worsening and getting out of control, and create necessary conditions for turning the situation around. Secondly, it is necessary to act in accordance with the provisions and spirit of the Security Council resolutions on the DPRK and push for an appropriate settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula. Since last year, the Council has adopted unanimously a series of resolutions on the DPRK. These resolutions represent the common will of the international community and constitute international obligations that must be observed by all parties. All parties must implement the Council resolutions on the DPRK comprehensively and in their entirety, strengthen non-proliferation measures to curb the DPRK's nuclear and missile programs, and also actively push for a peaceful settlement through diplomatic and political means. At the same time, there is a need to avoid negative impact on the livelihood of the people of the DPRK and the humanitarian assistance activities in the country. Unilateral sanction measures without the authorization of the Security Council undermine the unity of the Council and hurt the legitimate rights and interests of other countries and should therefore be abandoned. Thirdly, it is necessary for all sides to shoulder their due responsibilities and fulfill their own obligations in earnest. The current situation on the peninsula is not caused by any one party alone, and it is not helpful to impose on any one party the responsibility of resolving the problem. The parties concerned should move towards each other instead of engaging in mutual blaming. Still less should they try to shift their responsibilities to others. The U.S. has committed to not seeking regime change, not pursuing the overthrow of the DPRK's government, not accelerating the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and not moving its troops beyond the 38th parallel. We hope that the U.S. will turn these four commitments into concrete actions. Fourthly, it is necessary to remain committed to peaceful settlement and resume dialogue and negotiations as soon as possible. The core of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula is security, so the fundamental solution lies in addressing in a balanced way the security concerns of all parties, including the DPRK. There is no military option when it comes to the settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula, and resort to force can only bring disastrous consequences to the peninsula. Sanctions are means, not the end. History shows that dialogue and negotiations are the fundamental way to ease tension and advance denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. The parties concerned should endeavor to turn the pressure of sanctions into the driving force for the resumption of dialogue and negotiations, and pull the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula back to the right track of peaceful settlement through dialogue and negotiations at an early date. Mr. President, as a close neighbor of the Korean Peninsula, China has persisted in promoting denuclearization of the peninsula, maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula, and seeking a settlement through dialogue and negotiations. China is opposed to conflicts and chaos on the Korean Peninsula. China has always supported and implemented comprehensively and strictly the Security Council resolutions on the DPRK. In so doing, China has made greater efforts and paid a higher price than anyone else. It is irresponsible to doubt or challenge what China has done. In view of the current situation on the peninsula, China has put forward the suspension for suspension proposal, namely suspension by the DPRK of nuclear and missile activities and suspension by the U.S. and the ROK of large-scale military exercises. We have proposed the dual-track approach of promoting parallel progress in denuclearization and the establishment of a peace mechanism on the peninsula. The Russian Federation has also put forward the idea of a phased approach to the settlement of the issues of the Korean Peninsula. On the basis of the above proposals, China and the Russian Federation issued a joint statement on July 4th this year, proposing a roadmap for the settlement of the Korean Peninsula's problems. The joint proposals of China and Russia are practical and feasible and are aimed at promoting the peaceful settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula and maintaining the peace and stability on the peninsula. As such, we hope they will elicit response and support from the parties concerned. Mr. President, due to historical reasons, the Korean Peninsula is still in the shadow of the Cold War. This is the root cause for the protraction and lack of settlement of the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula. The parties concerned need to reject Cold War thinking in all its forms, establish a concept of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and seek a peaceful settlement of the Korean nuclear issue through political and diplomatic means, so as to realize at an early date denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and long-term security and tranquility of the Northeast Asia for the benefit of the people of the countries in the region. China stands ready to work together with the parties concerned and the international community to continue to play a positive and constructive role for the realization of this goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give floor to representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Thank you, Mr.
Madame
President.
et Messieurs les ministres,
Ladies and gentlemen, ministers,
je remercie la présidence japonaise.
I would like to thank the Japanese presidency for having convened this important meeting, and I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his very elucidating briefing. Mr. President, France is deeply concerned at the worsening situation on the Korean Peninsula and by the significant risks that arise for our collective security. This year, the North Korean regime fired 20 ballistic missiles, 3 of them intercontinental, and carried out a nuclear test on an unprecedented scale. And we have met 17 times, 12 of those times on an emergency basis. North Korea today is an existential threat for our partners in the region, and I would like to assure them of our complete, total solidarity in the face of this unacceptable situation. This unprecedented accumulation of illicit action, which is increasingly destabilizing, has all the hallmarks of a dangerous escalation. The risk is real and proven, and has already reached an elevated and increasing level. This is why inaction and weakness are not options. So, for France, our action should be guided by 3 priorities. The first of these priorities is to show ourselves clear-sighted in the face of the extreme seriousness of the situation. The multifaceted progress of North Korea in the nuclear area, including its ballistic capacity, and probably in the chemical area as well, really does change the situation. The regional threat has now become a global threat, an immediate threat. Let's not be under any illusions. This threat is unprecedented and has no equivalent. The North Korean regime, however, has up to date shown no intention to reverse course. By marching ahead with its nuclear and ballistic illicit programs, it continues to flout its international obligations and to defy this Council, and that to the detriment of its own population. I would stress here that the dramatic situation for human rights in North Korea is getting worse, and we heard about this at the beginning of this week with regard to the humanitarian situation. It is the North Korean regime which is primarily responsible for this. Mr. President, in the light of this very dangerous and volatile situation, and this is my second point, our central line of action must be to stand firm. First of all, because the dangerous downward spiral that North Korea has engaged upon threatens the very foundations of our collective security system, and together we have the responsibility to preserve that. It is essential that we react to this testing of the non-proliferation regime and avoid any impunity which would necessarily lead others to call this into question. What is at stake here is our ability to ensure our own security, but also to stop the overturning of the strategic balance in Asia, and beyond that, the strategic stability which is the foundation for peace and security. As part of this, our action should contain 2 areas. It is indispensable, first of all, to implement existing sanctions strictly and comprehensively in the face of the formidable inventiveness of the North Korean networks to circumnavigate and escape the effects of these decisions. Everyone knows the uneven implementation of sanctions seriously affects the effectiveness of our collective action. Their correct implementation is the responsibility of all member states, beginning with these seated on this Council.
We must also react methodically and with determination to all North Korean provocations in order to prevent further escalation and to preserve the non-proliferation regime. If North Korea continues to ignore our injunctions to defy them and not show reason, North Korea will leave us with no other choice than to stand firm and to strengthen sanctions. And let's understand that sanctions are not a goal in themselves. They target the regime for what it does and not for what it is. Mr. President, the third and final priority must be the potential for diplomacy to find a political solution. We do not and have never closed the door to dialogue. All of our efforts, on the contrary, are aimed at convincing Pyongyang to come back to the table of negotiations and to accept negotiations on its nuclear and ballistic program. But we are forced to state that given the stubbornness of North Korea, only maximum pressure today can enable us to come back to the path of negotiation. Mr. President, France, of course, is in favor of a resumption of talks, but it is up to the North Korean regime to give us clear indications that it is prepared to open discussions, and the sooner the better. Mr. President, France's belief is that maximum pressure on the North Korean regime is our best lever to enable dialogue, which itself is the condition for a political solution. Otherwise, everything will be seen as a sign of weakness by North Korea. Expressions of division between us, they will be encouraged to continue their provocations. And objectively, that will run the risk of things getting even worse and more extreme. So, quite simply, France would call on this Council to show firmness. That is our best antidote in the light of the risk of war, and it's our best chance to open up the path to dialogue and therefore to a political solution that we all seek. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Japanese presidency for organizing this timely and important high-level session on the issue of the DPRK, and we are pleased to see you presiding, Mr. Minister. Our minister would have been here today if it had not been for the IGAD Council of Ministers meeting and the high-level revitalization forum, both due to take place over the coming days in Addis Ababa. We thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his briefing on the topic of our discussion today, which we understand was one of the issues raised during his visit to Tokyo. We share his views. No wonder, therefore, in this statement, we may have to repeat what the Secretary General has stressed. Mr. President, we can imagine the level of anxiety and deep concern in Japan concerning the repeated ballistic missiles tests by the DPRK. We know most of those missiles fell into Japan's exclusive economic zone, and some of them flew over its territory. As the only country to ever suffer a nuclear attack, it's not difficult to realize how sensitive this issue is to the Japanese people and government. However, the nuclear and ballistic missile activities of the DPRK pose grave danger, not only to Japan and the Northeast Asia region. As a matter of fact, there is no greater threat to global peace and security at the moment than the potential nuclear catastrophe that is hanging over the Korean Peninsula. It doesn't require to be an expert of the area to know that no war in the peninsula would be limited. The possibility of its widening must be taken for granted. That's why every possible diplomatic effort must be made to avert this dangerous situation, which could potentially have devastating consequences for the region and the world at large. Mr. President, at this stage, it has become all the more apparent that there is no other option than a peaceful and diplomatic path to resolving the crisis in the Korean Peninsula. In this regard, priority should be given to easing the heightened tensions and avoiding the risk of miscalculations, including by the reopening of communication channels, if so far there are none. We have no illusion that the DPRK issue can be resolved anytime soon, but it is absolutely important that all sides start taking even small but meaningful steps to build the necessary trust and confidence, which could help pave the way for the resumption of dialogue and negotiation to find a comprehensive and lasting solution to the DPRK issue and achieve the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This, everybody agrees, is the key to preserving the peace and security of Northeast Asia. We very much welcome the visit to the DPRK by Under-Secretary General Jeffrey Feltman, the first such visit by a senior official of the United Nations since 2010. This is a small but important step in the right direction, and we very much appreciate the briefing that we received on the range of discussions he had with North Korean officials in Pyongyang, which we found extremely useful. What this visit has shown is that the engagement of the United Nations, and particularly the Secretary General's good offices, could be helpful. Even though nothing concrete came out of the visit by Under-Secretary General Feltman, we believe the various discussions he held might have contributed to a better understanding of the thinking in Pyongyang and to devising a strategy of engagement to bring the DPRK back to the negotiating table. That, in our view, is very critical. In the meantime, the full and effective implementation of the various Security Council resolutions by all member states remains very crucial. As the chair of the 1718 committee said in his annual report, and I quote, to create conditions to restarting negotiations while at the same time hindering the development of nuclear and ballistic missiles programs of the DPRK, end of quotation. This notwithstanding, we'd like to point out the need to pay attention to the humanitarian situation in the country. We hope the recent UN engagement with the DPRK government will contribute to improving the provision of life-saving humanitarian assistance to the population in need. This might also contribute to raising the level of mutual confidence, which is so much non-existent now. We welcome the presence at this meeting of the representative of the DPRK. Finally, Mr. President, it's only through the unity of the Council that we can avert the dangerous situation in the Korean Peninsula. And it's only appropriate that at this critical juncture to focus on what would contribute to the further enhancement of the cooperation among members of the Council to ensure the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We should not lose hope on the possibility of achieving that goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
President.
Your Excellency, Minister, we welcome you as President of this Security Council meeting. We thank the Secretary-General of the United Nations for his briefing on the situation around the Korean Peninsula. There can be no doubt that currently we are living through one of the most acute and dramatic phases in the development of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. It is possible to say without exaggeration that peace in this region is subject to serious tests, and the threat of the increase in, or the transition in the confrontation to a hotspot is very great. Military rhetoric accompanied by a test of strength between the participants has led to a situation where around the world people have begun to wonder whether there will be war or not. As is known, in the conditions of such tension, one ill-thought-out or misinterpreted step could lead to lamentable consequences. Russia has observed with concern the development of the situation in the region, the dangerous development indeed. Of course, we are united in our condemnation of the provocatory nuclear missile activity of Pyongyang, which in the last 18 months has taken on a dangerous trend. The situation is unacceptable when the latest launch is made without any prior notification from North Korean territory, subjecting the lives of citizens to risk, including those who are transiting through the air and sea in the region. We reject this activity by the DPRK, which confirms our support for all of the UN sanction activity, which we are unswervingly implementing. We call on the North Korean authorities to wind down their banned programs and to return to the non-proliferation regime of the NPT and also the IAEA as a non-nuclear state. At the same time, it should be clear to everybody that the DPRK is hardly going to refrain from its nuclear missile program while it feels a direct threat to its security. Indeed, this is how Pyongyang evaluates the regular, wide-scale maneuvers and exercises by the United States and its allies in the region. President, on the international sanctions on DPRK, once again, we would like to confirm our commitment to their implementation. Having said that, and we have emphasized this time and again, such measures should not be an end in themselves, but rather an instrument for drawing the country into constructive negotiations on substantive issues. Diplomacy isn't just sanctions. Sanctions aren't diplomacy, as some partners are trying to convince us. At least, it's not diplomacy in the traditional sense. It is an extreme instrument of involving people when all other methods have been exhausted. There is a whole range of different other methods within the diplomatic arsenal. In all sanctions decisions of the Council, there are also the requirement to fulfill a political component, which unfortunately many people have forgotten about, focusing instead only on restrictions. Resolving the nuclear issue is not possible just through pressure on Pyongyang and through sanctions. Sanctions should not be used to stifle the country in economic terms or to improve the humanitarian situation. This is particularly the case to unilateral restrictions, which affect civilian sectors which aren't connected with the nuclear missile program of the country. These sanctions are the reason for a serious worsening in the conditions of the living conditions of the population. Furthermore, unilateral limits which circumvent or add what's being done through the Security Council undermine the effective implementation of the Security Council's decisions on the political settlement of the situation on the Korean Peninsula, not to mention the damage that's been done to the legal interests of third countries. And incidentally, I'd like to say to the distinguished Secretary of State that the North Korean workers aren't working in Russia in slave-like conditions. They're working on the basis of an intergovernmental agreement with the DPRK which guarantees their rights. Incidentally, Secretary of State, since I'm already addressing you, we very much hope that the US will be able to resolve or help to resolve the crisis in the Korean Peninsula. Mentioning the sanction regimes within the Security Council, we have to recognize that the humanitarian exemptions that were identified under them aren't working. This has been said by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs recently in a briefing to the Specialized Committee 1718 of the Security Council. The ban on correspondence with banks in DPRK has made it difficult not only to procure food and goods for the national economy from abroad, but also the financing of those UN agencies that are working within the country. President, without question, DPRK's refusal to fulfill the corresponding Security Council resolutions is unacceptable. At the same time, we cannot allow any attempts to resolve these long-standing problems in the region just through military means. It's enough to look at the history of the Korean War to understand what that would mean. In the current conditions, we unswervingly call on all of the parties to not allow further escalation in tension, which accompanies each new cycle of reaction and counter-reaction. There is a need to review the policy of mutual pressure and intimidation. It won't bring us any results. We assume that there is a need for a comprehensive approach to resolving the situation. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is impossible without the general normalization of military political situation and refusing the increase in military infrastructure, including the deployment in the region of elements of the US global missile defense system, and also without cuts in the scale of the maneuvers carried out, and without founding the atmosphere of trust between the states in Northeast Asia. Unfortunately, recently we are seeing the reverse trend. 2.5 months of quiet from the point of Pyongyang were answered by Washington and its allies by unscheduled and unprecedented in their scale maneuvers and exercises in October and December, and also by the introduction of unilateral sanctions and classifying the country among state sponsors of terrorism. All of these steps force us to wonder about the sincerity of statements that suggest that there is a preference for a peaceful approach to resolving the crisis in DPRK. Chairman, we call on the interested parties to quickly take practical steps to de-escalate the situation. In particular, it would be good to refrain from the planned latest military exercises. It goes without question that Pyongyang is also obliged to finish its nuclear missile tests. We are ready for closer cooperation with all partners to aim to find a quick settlement of the issues on the Korean Peninsula through the only possible means, namely through political and diplomatic means, and through a mutually respectful dialogue. This was the aim behind the Russian-Chinese roadmap to settlement. We call on all interested parties in the period of preparation and the holding of the Winter Olympics in South Korea to refrain from any kind of provocation or unconsidered initiatives, and to use this time to find a way through a political and diplomatic settlement. And in conclusion, Chairman, I would like to address Minister Klimkin, who spoke today here. I'd like to advise him when he speaks to the Security Council and in his legends that he spoke about what happened in the Ukraine, that he might want to actually keep to the item on the agenda. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank the Secretary General Guterres for his informative report on this very serious matter. The situation around North Korea is an issue on which we all have a united position. First, we do not want the expansion of the nuclear club and will not accept any aspirations to acquire nuclear weapons by any state. Kazakhstan has been and remains an active supporter of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. This could be achieved through confidence building and finding a pragmatic compromise, a mutually safe and peaceful coexistence. Secondly, the DPRK's reckless actions to launch missiles and nuclear tests are recognized as the gravest violations of the Security Council resolutions. Kazakhstan has experienced all the devastating consequences of nuclear tests and therefore stands for their prohibition in the 21st century. Unfortunately, to this day, we are still not able to achieve the entry into force of the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, which could make ending of all tests a reality. we have to outlaw nuclear testing in the modern world. Thirdly, the DPRK should comply with the requirements of all security resolutions. Only a thorough and strict adherence to them can ease the sanctions regime imposed on Pyongyang. It is in the interest of the government of North Korea to engage in a substantive dialogue and resume the negotiation process to avoid irreversible negative consequences of its irresponsible behavior. In this respect, we recommend to capitalize on the recent contact between the UN Secretariat and the government of North Korea to expand the window of opportunity for peaceful cooperation and diplomacy. It is expedient to reduce the risk of conflict and further deterioration of the difficult humanitarian situation in light of cuts of funding, which can seriously affect the lives of ordinary citizens in the country. Mr. President, the current situation on the Korean Peninsula is indeed the most tense and dangerous than it has ever been before. We need to prevent all possible miscalculations and must strive to reduce the risk of escalating the conflict. All the sides should restrain from negative rhetorics and actions. We consider it is necessary to seek and create the prerequisites for continuing contacts initiated between the United Nations and Pyongyang. Today's meeting is the Security Council of the Security Council is a clear signal to North Korea that the nuclear path will not provide any guarantees for the security and well-being of its own people and of all others. Mr. President, the non-nuclear path of Kazakhstan can serve as a practical guide for DPRK and other countries striving to obtain nuclear capability. We have built and strengthened our independence and gained international respect by renouncing nuclear weapons. My president demonstrated a strong political will to rid of its nuclear weapons and tests in a very challenging environment at the time of radical transformation of the world order. And as the time showed, it was the right decision. And I thank you, State Secretary Rex Tillerson, for mentioning it at the last debate on DPRK in this very chamber. We therefore call on the leadership of North Korea to renounce its nuclear weapons for the benefit of all. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for his statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Quisiera en primer lugar agradecer a ustedes.
I'd like to begin by thanking you, Minister, for presiding over our work today, as well as the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his comprehensive briefing. We share the concern of the Japanese presidency of the Security Council, and we think it's very opportune that the meeting has been organized today. This is particularly important at a time when the situation on the North Korean Peninsula represents the greatest threat to international peace and security. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, be they nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, constitute a real and serious threat to international peace and security. These weapons must not be used by anyone and not under any circumstances. Uruguay insists on recalling that when it comes to disarmament and non-proliferation, it is the duty of all states to strictly respect their commitments in accordance with international law, such as the NPT and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. On numerous occasions, Uruguay has expressed its fervent condemnation of nuclear tests and the launching of ballistic missiles carried out by North Korea. We will continue to do so if this country continues with its threatening behavior and if it continues to violate resolutions of the Security Council. Uruguay once again calls upon North Korea to abandon its nuclear program in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner, immediately ceasing all related activities, including the launching of ballistic missiles with ballistic technology. We urge them to return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the safeguards regime of the IAEA. Mr. President, the sanctions imposed have attempted to be the means to bring the North Korean government to the negotiating table. However, and despite all of the calls that have been issued by the international community to begin a dialogue, to date it has not been possible to open up the door to negotiation, but it is this that is indispensable to de-escalate the situation. The sanctions imposed on North Korea must be implemented completely and effectively by all member states. At the same time, these must not have adverse effects on the population. This is why, Mr. President, we are concerned at information received that sanctions could be having negative effects, non-intentional negative effects on the humanitarian situation in the country. And that's why we feel it would be appropriate to conduct a cautious analysis of them. Throughout our participation as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, Uruguay has supported all actions taken by this organ with regard to North Korea. We have also always stated a position on this issue which supports all of those initiatives aimed at dialogue. There is no military solution to the problem in North Korea. The solution for the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula has to be a peaceful one, achieved through negotiations, diplomatic negotiations, and which leads to a political agreement between the parties. It is towards this end that we must work without delay before it is too late and before we are forced to lament a disaster of devastating proportions. We particularly appreciate the recent visit of the USG for Political Affairs, Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, to North Korea, which is a specific step in the right direction after an extremely prolonged hiatus. It is crucial, therefore, to keep these channels of communication open between the United Nations and the government of North Korea. This will make it possible to create the appropriate conditions for a resumption of negotiations. In order to do this, Mr. President, it will also be necessary to address the interests and the legitimate concerns of all parties to the issue. Therefore, efforts aimed at generating trust between the parties should be increased. As members of the United Nations, there is no alternative to dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Uruguay for his statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Senegal.
Thank you very much, President. Senegal thanks Japan for having organized this open debate, and we're very pleased to see the Minister presiding over this debate on the issue of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We also thank Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, for his statement, which has contributed to enriching our debate. President, here we are yet again in this forum to discuss non-proliferation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Each time, my country, Senegal, has restated its firm condemnation for the number of acts of defiance that this country has perpetrated against the international community and against the Security Council in particular through its 17 launches of ballistic missiles, 2 of which are intercontinental, and also a 6th nuclear test in December. The North Korean authorities presented this as a test of a hydrogen bomb of a yield that has been unprecedented. This is a game changer because with this new intercontinental ballistic missile launch of the 28th of November, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, having methodically continued its program for nuclear weapons and for missiles, has shown more than ever its determination to acquire, if it hasn't already, military nuclear capacity. Senegal sees this as a grave threat to the non-proliferation regime, which could exacerbate the tensions that are already very high on the peninsula and also beyond. It also represents a serious threat not only for the population of the peninsula and the region, but also security of air transport in this part of the world, which is heavily populated and also sees a lot of dense air traffic. In this context, the Security Council has a serious challenge because despite all of the resolutions and sanctions and other measures that this body has taken, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, far from abandoning its nuclear ambitions, has gone as far as challenging the very competence of this council to examine the issue presented by its military program. We recently adopted resolutions 2371 and 2375, but that's not changed anything. Therefore, the question arises, what more do we have to do to encourage this country to respect its international commitments in this area in a clear, verifiable and irreversible fashion? To attempt to answer that question, my country, taking account of the fact that there cannot be a military solution to the crisis, which is what we all believe, has called for a holistic, peaceful and negotiated solution through an open and loyal dialogue. It also encourages the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to resume the place that it unfortunately chose to leave when negotiations, the six-party negotiations, were taking place. Senegal has also insistently called on the DPRK to respect its international commitments, while stressing that targeted measures that have been taken with good reason within the most recent Security Council resolution on DPRK to respond to the challenge presented by the nuclear program and ballistic missile program, that those measures should be part of a holistic political strategy to encourage the parties to open dialogue for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and to do this with the active support of the international community, thereby creating the conditions for peaceful coexistence between the countries and peoples of the region. In other words, the member states should redouble their efforts and should fully meet their commitments made in different resolutions, because the lack of genuine political will and also the lack of capacity among member states can only facilitate the proliferation of WMDs. Senegal is of the view that we should work to strengthen the authority of the Non-Proliferation Treaty by making it universal and also by respecting other commitments previously made. We remain convinced that the universalization of the NPT and the application of its relevant provisions, as well as resolute action to ensure the entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, represent decisive milestones towards general and complete disarmament. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Senegal for his statement. I now give the floor to representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you and to thank the Japanese presidency for convening this important meeting, as well as the Secretary General for his briefing. We appreciate also USG Jeff Feldman's visit to Pyongyang last week and support the United Nations' efforts to establish a channel of communication with the North Korean authorities, also in order to reduce the risk of unintentional escalation. Mr. President, there can be no ambiguity in our analysis of the current scenario. The deterioration registered over the past year is a direct consequence of the North Korean regime's illegal and destabilizing activities. This threat is immediate and global in scope. We extend once again our full solidarity with the citizens of Japan and South Korea. And we cannot forget the plight of the people of North Korea, while the government diverts energies and resources towards the development of illegal weapons of mass destruction. Mr. President, we have repeatedly seen how the DPRK's regime unprecedented provocations in the development of nuclear arms and missile capabilities have flared up tensions in the Korean Peninsula and beyond, constituting, in our view, one of the gravest threats to international peace and security we are facing today. We strongly condemn these activities and call on North Korea to abide to its international obligations. We also call on the DPRK to abandon its chemical weapons program and immediately adhere to the Chemical Weapons Convention as called for in Resolution 2371. Mr. President, it is clear that a conflict in the Korean Peninsula would be catastrophic for the region and for the world. This Council response, therefore, to the situation in the DPRK this year has been forceful and effective. 3 new resolutions have been approved, providing for the most comprehensive set of sanctions in a generation. We have also taken significant additional measures at the European Union and national levels. Italy recently interrupted the accreditation procedure for the designated DPRK ambassador to Rome. The sanctions are meant to achieve 3 main goals. First, to make North Korean regime realize that further provocation will only lead to greater isolation. Second, to stop the DPRK from exploiting the interconnected nature of the global economy in order to fund its illegal weapons program. Third, to provide the necessary leverage in order to bring about a verifiable change in the regime policies, therefore opening the way towards a political solution based on complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. And I wish to emphasize that this strategy will fully work only if 2 conditions are met. First, full and comprehensive implementation of the sanctions by the whole UN membership, and second, continued unity in the Council on this issue. As chair of the 17-18 Sanctions Committee, Italy has worked to improve the implementation of sanctions throughout this year. But many challenges remain. Such an articulated and wide sanction regime requires constant interaction with member states to bridge information gaps. Furthermore, many countries face capacity challenges. There is also an issue related to timing. The delay in transposing sanctions provisions into national legislation may create opportunities for evading them. This is also why it is crucial to submit national implementation reports on time. While we have seen a steady increase over the last year, there is room for improvement. Let me underline the importance and urgency of submitting implementation reports by all member states for all DPRK sanctions resolutions. Lastly, Mr. President, I wish to reiterate that sanctions are not meant to have unintended negative consequences on the humanitarian situation in the country, which continues to be a matter of serious concern, while bearing in mind that it is the DPRK regime which bears primary responsibility for improving the livelihood of its people. We continue to engage with all relevant stakeholders on this issue, and I chaired last week a productive Sanctions Committee meeting on the humanitarian situation. In this context, we renew our appeal to humanitarian actors to make full use of the relevant existing exemption provided for in the various Security Council resolutions. And at the same time, we believe that a more timely and systematic interaction between the UN agencies and the committee, the 17-18 committee, could go a long way in preventing unnecessary obstacles in providing critical humanitarian assistance to the North Korean people. And I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Minister. We would like to begin by welcoming you here, Minister, today to the Security Council to preside over our work. We would also like to thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his briefing. Bolivia, as a pacifist country, promotes the dialogue, the culture of dialogue and the right to peace and cooperation between peoples with full right to their sovereignty and diplomacy between their peoples. In this respect, our constitution prohibits the manufacture and use of chemical, biological or nuclear weapons on Bolivian territory. As part of the first zone that is densely populated in the world that declared itself free of nuclear weapons through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Such Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and as the first region to declare itself a zone of peace, we urge that this example be replicated in other areas of the world. Mr. President, in this regard, Bolivia expresses its most firm and energetic condemnation of the launching of ballistic missiles as well as the nuclear tests carried out by the DPRK. And we would call upon this country to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile program in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner, and comply with the provisions of the Security Council resolutions and return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We would point out here the importance of adherence to the United Nations Charter, according to which the Security Council is the only legal body that can take the measures necessary in order to maintain or re-establish international peace and security, in this way ruling out any unilateral action. This is why we reject any act of provocation or implication of unilateral sanctions, because these not only constitute a flagrant violation of international law, but also because they undermine the efforts and the work of multilateral organizations such as our own, because they extend the jurisdiction and internal legislation of one state to another, violating the principles of equality, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. This is why we would urge all parties involved to avoid increasing tensions and an escalation of rhetoric, and we would call for an end to this spiral of confrontation and threats of the use of armed force. It must be understood that there can be no military solution to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Mr. President, the sanctions imposed in resolutions adopted by this Council should not be an end in themselves. They should serve as an opportunity to bring the parties to the negotiating table in order to resume dialogue and achieve a peaceful, diplomatic and political solution, the aim of which will be the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So far this year, the Security Council has approved 3 resolutions, increasingly harsh, which, depending on their degree of implementation, are also affecting the civilian population with possible humanitarian consequences. We believe that, as it is clearly stated in these very resolutions, it is not only necessary to work to implement these sanctions, but also to approach dialogue, come round to dialogue, and to resume the 6-party talks. This is essential. Here we reiterate our support for the Chinese initiative of suspension for suspension, which would make it possible to have a simultaneous suspension on the Korean Peninsula. On the one hand, the DPRK would stop its nuclear and ballistic tests immediately, and on the other hand, all kinds of unilateral or joint exercises in the region should be also ceased. And here we would reiterate our support for the Russian-Chinese proposal and roadmap, which to date is the only concrete proposal that has been presented to resolve the situation. Along these lines, the efforts undertaken to re-establish mechanisms for dialogue of those measures, we would highlight the recent visit to DPRK of USG Mr. Jeffrey Feltman to the country, and we hope that these channels of communication that were able to be established will remain open in order to initiate a dialogue without preconditions and to build mutual trust. Finally, Mr. President, my delegation would like to state that today we are meeting at a time of great tension globally. But with regard to the situation on the North Korean peninsula, on the Korean peninsula, we feel it's important to begin dialogue that will give rise to stability in the region and achieve just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia for his statement. The representative of Ukraine has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thanks, Mr. President. I wanted to use my right to react to what the Russian representative has just said. One point about the proper format addressing different issues. Basically, it was about Russia breaking the Budapest Memorandum and all kind of legal, written and unwritten commitments, in the sense of creating the atmosphere of impunity, which contributed to the situation where we are now. And if, the moment I were listening to your presentation, Mr. President, and the narrative about the DPRK, it's basically about breaking international law, sanctions, and hostages. It's actually the same narrative what we have on Russia, breaking international law, sanctions, hostages. So we have one big rock state, one smaller rock state, and the difference is actually only in scale. But but I wanted also to react to one point, which is for me twisted, irresponsible, and mind-blowing logic. The Russian representative has said that basically North Korean nuclear and missile program, in a way, in answer on the trainings around the North Korea. Russia were having military drillings, the most, fundamental in scale this year in Belarus, trying to screw everybody up about their goals and scale. So following Russian logic, I should now call for my country to become, nuclear and to develop a missile program. In a way, it's actually the whole irresponsible logic which could trigger a nuclear race in the whole world tomorrow. So I believe we have to stop trying to find any kind of excuses for any kind of wrong behavior. It's my fundamental point. And I wanted to use this opportunity simply to make this point again. Thanks, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Klimkin for his statement. The representative of Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you very much, President. I'll be very brief. I'm not going to get into a discussion of the substance of what the Ukrainian delegate said. I'm pleased to see that there are many different nations in the room today because they have the opportunity to see the lack of respect for the Ukrainian delegation to the UN Security Council and the other member states. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement, and now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Cho Hyun, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, thank you very much for convening this meeting and the opportunity to speak to the Council. I also thank the Secretary General for his briefing. Let me start by rewinding the clock to December 2016. The Council had adopted resolutions 2270 and 2321 in response to North Korea's fourth and fifth nuclear tests, with the hope that this would change the behavior of North Korea. However, fast forwarding to December 2017, the situations have further deteriorated. North Korea conducted yet another nuclear test and launched 20 ballistic missiles this year. To be fair, the international community responded by further strengthening and implementing the Security Council resolutions while not losing sight of the efforts to resume dialogues. These endeavors, however, have not been enough to bring North Korea back to the negotiation table for denuclearization. Mr. President, just over a couple of weeks ago, North Korea launched its most advanced ballistic missile with intercontinental range. North Korea claimed afterwards to have achieved the completion of its state nuclear force. Amid diverging assessment, what is certain is that North Korea is indeed in the final stages of nuclear weaponization. If completed, it will fundamentally alter the security landscape in the region and beyond. Many commentators point out that it will aggravate tension in the already heavily militarized region and even worry about the risk of nuclear proliferation to rogue states and non-state actors. North Korea also threatens to shatter the foundation of international non-proliferation regimes and continues to inflict lasting harm on its own people. The international community, now more so than ever, must grasp the gravity and urgency of the North Korean threat and find ways to halt its nuclear program and bring it back to the path of denuclearization. Mr. President, what matters more now is not a mere assessment of the North Korean threat, but rather our united will and firm action against this regime. North Korea is fiercely waging a battle of wills against the international community. It wants to be recognized as a nuclear weapon state on its own terms and conditions. Our answer should be absolutely no. We should not be coerced by North Korea's continuing provocations, but rather uphold our principles while firmly responding to its reckless behaviors. At the same time, we should not be provoked into conflict, nor should we shut the doors of dialogue and peace. Our common goal is the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea in a peaceful manner. In this context, I would like to underscore that 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games should be an Olympic for peace. My government urges North Korea to join the Olympic Games and to seize this opportunity for dialogues. North Korea is also waging a battle of actions against the international community. Time and again, North Korea has found and taken advantage of the loopholes in the Council resolutions. North Korea has preyed on the weak links of the international community. The sanctions are not an end in themselves and are not meant to bring down North Korea, but to bring it to the negotiation table for denuclearization. However, we are to bring the unwilling North Korea back to the table. We must fill in all gaps identified in the implementation of the resolutions. In this regard, we deeply appreciate the active efforts of the 1718 Committee. The international community has made some progress, including the restriction on oil supply, the export ban on North Korea's key products, and the prohibition of overseas work authorization. Many countries, even those with long-standing relationship with North Korea, have joined these efforts, including through the expulsion of individuals on the sanctions list. The record high number of submissions of international implementation of reports for resolutions 2270 and 2321 is a testimony to the enhanced awareness of the international community regarding the North Korean threat. However, in our race against North Korea, we need to do more, way more. North Korea's evasive tactics are becoming more sophisticated, and this regime continues to exploit all weak links. In fact, the Republic of Korea has been actively cooperating with its partners to identify and stop North Korea's attempts to evade sanctions and seek alternative routes to sell coals and other banned products and to illegally import oil. Let me emphasize that none of us should become that weak link, and that none of us should condone groups and individuals who assist North Korea's defiance against this Council. In this regard, sharing best practices against North Korea's evasive tactics would be helpful in closing the loopholes. Mr. President, I began my remarks by recalling how we ended the year 2016 and how North Korea defiantly continued its series of provocations in 2017. We cannot afford to sit again at the end of 2018 and feel as if it were a deja vu of 2017, regretting our business as usual approach. The Council members and the international community must redouble their efforts to ensure a seamless and complete implementation of the sanctions and apply as much pressure as necessary until North Korea returns to the negotiation table with a sincere willingness for denuclearization. With a sense of urgency, we should make North Korea perceive without a doubt that it will pay heavily for its provocations, that it will never be accepted as a nuclear weapon state, and that dialogue for denuclearization is the only viable option. The Republic of Korea reaffirms its solid commitment to achieve the denuclearization of North Korea and the establishment of permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. We will work closely with all countries to this end. Thank you.
His Excellency Mr. Cho for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, at the outset, I condemn Japan in my strongest possible terms for its holding presidency of the UN Security Council during December this year and instigated by the United States is now making as able use of its opportunity by convening the ministerial briefings of UN Security Council on non-proliferation issue of the DPRK. I have to mention about that the meeting today is none other than a desperate measure plotted by the US being terrified by the incredible might of our republic that has successfully achieved the great historic cause of completing the state nuclear force, cause of building of a rocket power through a great November event. I believe that if non-proliferation issue is to be discussed, the first countries to be brought before the Court of Justice at the U.S., who is the kingpin of virtual and horizontal proliferation, popping astronomical almost of funds into the modernization of nuclear weapons and hindering in every way the denuclearization of the Middle East, and Japan, who keeps more than necessary stockpile of plutonium and seeks every opportunity to produce nuclear weapons. Our possession of nuclear weapons was an individual self-defensive measures of defend our sovereignty and rights of existence and development from the U.S. nuclear threat and blackmail, and anyone is to blame for it. The U.S. is the one who must be held accountable. There are several nuclear power states over the world now, but there is no country like the U.S. who is continuing to openly threat and blackmail other countries with its nuclear weapons. We could easily draw to the answer of this case, only being noted now much amount of money of the U.S. is running through for the maintenance and modernization of its nuclear weapons. It is already well known to the outside that the U.S. has now stockpiled more than 4,000 nuclear warheads in its nuclear arsenals, deploying over 115 technical nuclear bombs over the territory of its NATO allies, and is now planning to consume of around $1 trillion for its nuclear weapons maintenance and modernization during 30 years in future. All of the figures above clearly prove that the U.S. is only the ringleader in nuclear proliferation. It is also disturbing to see the UN Security Council acting like tools of the U.S. and playing to each turn instead of keeping impartiality as the lifeline in its activities through to its mission to pressure international peace and security. It is the UN Security Council of today that, while ignoring our repeated request to bring the issue of the provocative and aggressive joint military exercise on the table of the Council, the most graphic manifestation of nuclear threat and blackmail of the U.S. keeps itself busy knowing to the U.S. that assessed sanctions and pressure against us by condemning our self-defensive measures. The DPRK, at every time when the U.S.-South Korean joint military exercise that threatening seriously the peace and security of the South Korean peninsula is a region, and the world outraged submitted the letters to the Security Council for 11 times from the year 2015, requesting to raise the issue and discuss it immediately at the Council. However, on the contrary, turning away its face at every time of our request for such aggressive joint military exercise to the last, the UN Security Council has adopted 11 sanction resolutions against my country, denouncing our self-defensive measures as a threat to international peace and security. With all above-mentioned fact, we could easily prove unfairness, double standard, and party prejudice of the Security Council. As we have clarified in the government statement, the development and advancement of the strategic weapons of the DPRK are entirely to defend the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the country from the U.S. nuclear blackmail policy and the nuclear threat, and to ensure the peaceful life of the people, and therefore we would not pose any threat to any country and region as long as the interests of the DPRK are not infringed upon. Reiterating once again, our nuclear force is served thoroughly for each mission as self-defensive deterrent, and it is fully according to the Rule 51 of the UN Charter, stipulating the right of exercise of self-defense measures to be made by individual UN member states. The DPRK is in accordance with the decree of the Supreme People's Assembly adopted on 1 April 2013, has established the abolished perfect system and order of stockpiling and maintaining the fully guarantee any kind of illegal transfer of nuclear weapons, its technology, and weapon-grade nuclear materials. As of the result, there is no single case being raised about our nuclear proliferation up to the moment. All of the data of impurity related with my country's proliferation scattered by hostile forces are totally groundless plot intending to defend the dignity of the DPRK, the powerful nuclear state, and nothing but the only violation behavior of interfensive by picking up the issue of strengthening of our national defensive measures. The possession of the nuclear by the DPRK could not be the violation of any international law and regulation in any case, for the DPRK has withdrawn from the NPT in a most justified way. At the same time, it is clear to everybody that the DPRK does not infringe any interest of other countries, and the purpose of possession of nuclear deterrent is only for self-defensive and to safeguard the peace of the region. The DPRK, whatever what says, will march forward and make great advancement victoriously as world's most powerful nuclear and military state, upholding the line on simultaneously development of the two fronts. In accordance hereby, I reform once again that the DPRK, as a responsible nuclear power and a peace-loving state, will sincerely fulfill its non-proliferation obligation assumed before the international society, and put its every effort to achieve the noble cause of safeguarding world peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for his statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Rex Tillerson.
Thank you. I'd like to take a moment to respond to the statements of the DPRK permanent representative. First, I think we have heard all of these things before from this government. There is no doubt that the DPRK's pursuit of a nuclear arsenal is in clear violation of international law, directly challenges the global non-proliferation regime, and greatly threatens international peace and security. This body has unanimously made these points for well over a decade now. The international community condemns North Korea's pursuit of a nuclear arsenal, and we will never accept a nuclear North Korea. The DPRK's unlawful acts cannot be ignored nor can they be explained away. The DPRK must be held accountable for its actions. And in that regard, any notion that the source of tensions on the peninsula are the fault of no one party, there is but one party that has carried out illegal detonation of nuclear devices. There is but one party that continues to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, overflying another sovereign nation, Japan, threatening civil aviation security because these launches are undertaken with no notification. There is but one party that has been targeted with punishment and penalties through the most vigorous regime sanction ever enacted, and that is the Kim regime in North Korea. They alone are responsible for these tensions. They alone must take responsibility for these tensions, and they alone can solve these tensions.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Tillerson for his statement. I shall now make concluding remarks in my capacity as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan. Japan has consistently devoted itself to create a free and democratic country, respecting human rights and abiding by the rule of law, and to support peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region as a peace-loving nation. The path Japan has walked as a peace-loving nation will not change in future and contribute to the peace and prosperity of the world more than ever before. In our meeting today, we have condemned in the strongest terms the acts of provocation by North Korea in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. We once again made it clear that the international community will never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. I call on all the member states to fully implement the relevant Security Council resolutions and maximize international pressure on North Korea in order to realize a denuclearized Korean peninsula. After our presidency this month, Japan will leave the Security Council. However, we will continue to cooperate closely with the remaining and incoming members, as well as non-Security Council members, so that the North Korean issue will be properly addressed in the Council. I resume my function as a President of the Council. The representative of the Republic of Korea has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Cho Hyun.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am compelled to reply to North Korea's truly regrettable arguments. As shown in the multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions, the international community has repeatedly made it clear that it will not recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state in any case. North Korea must stop provocations and sincerely return to dialogue for denuclearization. Hopefully, North Korea will recognize that this is the only path to a secure and stable future. Thank you.
There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.